Welcome back. S- Fantasy Football School is in session. This is the process. My name is Dr. John Bush. This is lesson 7 today. The big concept is coherence of data sets. And this is material inspired by my textbook, Winning Your Fantasy Football Drafts. Hopefully get it out, the updated edition, but I might just let the videos here supersede the Kindle books here. I think people are into more visuals and whatnot, so we'll see how that goes. Anyway, let's start. Uh, so we've had previous lessons, and it's pretty clear that more information does not increase our understanding per se. And here's the kicker: unless the information increases our coherence of the data set that we're looking at. So in all these lessons coming, we're going to be heavily into the data. Just throwing out tidbits of information that does not increase our coherence is probably not very productive. So when you hear that word, you think, oh, well, too much information is not good. It's two factors. Is the information that you're listening to related to each other? So if it's pretty much the same metrics you're measuring, then you're going to get befuddled by all the twists and turns of saying the same thing. And the second is coherence, which is logical. It makes good sense. It's organized. It has clarity for you. These are all synonyms with coherence. So my goal, and it's doesn't mean everybody's going to make this journey, folks. And I'm just being a college professor, for since 1995. Well, I was a teaching assistant before that, starting in the early 80s. So I've been teaching at the college level since probably about 1981, 82, but as a professor since 1995. Not everybody gets coherence of data sets, right? Or everybody would be doctors and whatnot. So it's just not everybody's going to make the journey. So don't get discouraged. Just try to go through the lessons multiple times, and maybe you'll get parts of it that will help your coherence of fantasy football data sets. So in fantasy football data, there must be meaningful relationships that have some underpinnings of what we call a logical foundation. Just throwing out ideas that, for no apparent reason, or, have some appeal that's not really based on any rigor. You can have talking points and get loud and hear the podcast, and they'll make all sorts of claims and whatnot, but I don't think it gives us this logical foundation I think you need to approach it. And again, these lessons are just how I do it. Okay. I mean, if you can flip a coin and make it work for you, then go for it. Multiple ways to enjoy yourselves in fantasy. So opinion-based information That's the issue that I see in fantasy. Opinion based. Judgments versus statistical algorithms. There's always been that debate, and it's really not from, obviously I'm coming from a different perspective, but I'm going with algorithms and stats over your judgment. No offense. Uh, there are experts, some are good judges, but if we look across a spectrum, I think I'll hang on to my stats. So opinion-based information will not increase our coherence if it's not based on coherence and logical underpinning, statistical analysis, scientific process, the questioning. Pundits are out there and they talk loud, and psychologically, somebody who has a loud talk always sounds more authoritarian. And it's probably evolution, right? Who we gonna get to lead us to attack the saber-toothed cats in the next valley to go cook our dinner? Hey, uh, we kind of snap to the authority kind of thing, but you have to kind of walk your way from all the opinions and take it for what it's worth. Probably a lot more entertainment than anything. In fact, that's why they have silly little games and trivia and music and noise and whistles and bells. Uh, an idea in search of data. That's can be the scariest thing in science. We also hear the word a technique in search of questions and data. In other words, when there's a new machine or equipment, people start trying to figure out to use that to gather information. And maybe you get lucky and you find something new. Certainly, outliers in data can really be telling us a lot. And, it's the black swan concept, and that can happen. The way I do it is I gather data based on a question. And then that frames to me this journey here. And then I will try to apply stats if possible. Remember, science is testable. Okay. So if there's something that can't be tested, then we really have a hard time dealing with that, right? I mean, the big thing is science is religion. Okay. It's hard to test religion. Don't think you can. So, anything in fantasy that comes along and can't be tested is probably outside the purview of certainly what I'm doing. So, questions are what lead you forward. And so that to me is where I'm trying to come from, thinking about questions. Questions. So at some point, we're going to cross the level of data that we can handle. Whatever that level is for you right now doesn't mean it's for you always. So part of the process, especially early on, I've been handling data analysis as a biologist since the 80s, working my master's and my PhD, my postdoc, and now as a full professor, I've come up the ranks and actually trained other PhDs. At some point, you prune your data out and focus, and you have to write a science paper, but you don't forget the other data. It's just it's not usable now, or it doesn't add to your coherence. So you're going to have to practice and that's going to require effort, and that may be beyond what you want to do. And probably these lessons are probably not going to be overly popular. Hey, what can I say? It's just something I feel like I need to do, so I'm going to do it. And eventually you're trying to activate this deeper, logical, slower system one thinking. Your fast and frugal system one doesn't like pruning data. It doesn't like piecing it out. It wants to gather everything, spill it, and make, a connection, right? And there's a lot of test on people when they look at what ink blots and what do you see in the ink blot. The ultimate scientist will say, I see an ink blot. I mean, I know it's good to have imagination and creativity. I got that. But it's an ink blot. Okay, it's blotches of ink, right? People will find Elvis in a potato chip, right? The profile. I mean, if you hunt long enough, you can start inventing things. You look outside and you'll see on the internet clouds that look like various, whatever, Godzilla or something. I love Godzilla, by the way. So System 1 likes a snapshot quick. So it doesn't mind lots of opinions thrown at it. And in fact, the more opinions that confirm your biases, System 1 is pleased. One way to do it is record keeping to figure out where your baseline of coherence is. And you will develop reference class forecasting as part of that process. And I've got a whole lecture on reference class forecasting that to me is, we've kind of reached the bottom at that point of the data, and we'll go through that. So gathering data, but I like questions that lead to data gathering. Obviously, questions have to come from something, right? So the science process is observational at some point. It's just you have to do experimental design while you're gathering data so that it's testable and you can come away with a statistical inference. Whether it's real or Memorex, it's good to know. So what's the minimum amount of information needed? Part of the issue is experts can overestimate certain factors that only really have a minor impact, and they might underestimate the few significant variables. So the models that we gather in fantasy football, we may not really be aware of the key things and variables that really influence what we're doing and our expertness. And certainly people would like to kind of winnow, i.e. prune it down, and that increases your coherence. That's kind of, we coming full circle here. I think the way to find those variables is principal component analysis, and I've got lectures coming up on that as well. So I'm kind of throwing out these tidbits of kind of where I'm going, these next block of material here. Okay, so data coherence, finding the variables are really key, helps our understanding. Note that the fantasy football that we have now is probably different than it was 20 years ago, right? Things change, right? Rules change, opinions change, knowledge of physiological training methods, these kind of, all that is changing, right? I mean, that's why the Olympics, you see records will be broken. At some point, there's going to be a limit until we, get synthetic people or something and change the paradigm. So, in the back of your mind, if there's a significant change, then some of what we're dealing with can also change. Our coherence may be off at that point. And there's always some of that every year, right? There's new players being added, new coaches, new things happening. So that's why it's not just a plug and play kind of, this happened last week, therefore it happens this week. There's tendencies of that, but rules are made to be broken and things will change. So just, if I describe something that's kind of squishy, uh, I'm sorry. That's, science does change. We don't get an idea and it stays like that in stone. Uh, I think religion is a lot like that. It's slower to change if it changes at all. Science is based on what we can prove false. It's called falsification. So when you get information and observations that prove an aspect false, that's when changes have to occur, right? So one observation can prove something false. If you've read The Black Swan, Nassim Taleb's book, right? All swans were white. And so when you went out as a naturalist in the field and you sampled the color of swans in Europe, they were all white. So one more piece of data really didn't change things, except when you went to Australia and found the black swan. Nothing in Europe could have predicted the black swan. So that's why you'll hear that concept. But one piece of data changed the paradigm. So now it's all swans are black and or white until we find an orange one, right? I don't think we'll find one, but you never know. Who knows? Certainly there are mutations, albinos, and other kinds of, mutants out there. It happens. So the key is many that you'll hear in fantasy football actually work to fit the models that are soothing to the audience, right? Uh, One of the reasons I don't listen to a lot of them is everybody's agreeing with everybody else. And even when they disagree, you always wonder, is this just, kind of a shtick they're pulling, or is this really a disagreement? I don't know. But if you ask them what's the hierarchy of their value of their variables, so we need to spend time through a discovery process, the scientific method, to find those variables and try to impart statistical analysis in those journeys. Remember, extreme events happen, stay with us for so long. Everybody remembers Odell Beckham's great one-handed catch. I mean, those things live with us, right? All these amazing Hail Marys, very sensationalist. You always expect it's going to happen again. So sometimes that can't over uh, overbias you to expect it to happen again. I mean, that's why slot machines are in business, right? Pull it, oh, and it's not, it's what is it? The reward doesn't come regularly, you know, and so that's part of the whole system. Uh, you know, the irregularness of the reward is part of it. I mean, if you pulled the slot and you won, you know, 10 cents on the dollar every time or 5 cents on the dollar, that'd be boring. People would get bored. I know. Well, they're making 5%. I know it's better than Treasury bonds. I got that. But people, I think they want that big thrill, that sensational activity. I think having at least knowledge of the unknowns is better than the unknown unknowns, right? The black swan. So, you know, it's the uncertainty, the level of uncertainty. That's the scariest thing is we don't know what we don't know. And that doesn't just scare me, that scares people that plan, right? Military leaders, you know, disaster people. You know, you can't predict things, the unknown unknowns. So all we can try to do is know what we know and try to explore the unknown aspect that we can study, that's apparent to us. I don't understand this aspect in fantasy. Let me try to do an approach to study that. So that's part of the journey here. So this middle model that we develop, and hopefully it changes because falsification and pruning and increasing your coherence is something we should all move to do. It never stops. Here's some things I don't know. It's the order, and I don't know the amount. I don't know if I was going to rate from the amount of importance from 1 to 10, right? 1 being not very important, but a little bit, versus 10 super important. I've got some bullet points there, things that I consider every year. I think most people do. It's always a big deal, strength of schedule, right? And again, I'm not starting with that as my number one. That's just the first one that I wrote. Okay. So that may not be the most important at all, is what I say in the hierarchical order. But you'll see that when the schedule comes out, there'll be a lot of articles real quick. And, you know, that's part of getting the clicks and making your money is get everybody to read my little tidbits. And so has a great schedule this year. Well, great. Let's just draft them number one then. You know, why worry about anything else? Okay. So how important is strength of schedule? I'm still working on that. If you're in a dynasty league, you do have an advantage every year in your rookie drafts. You know, if the league doesn't change a lot with new people, there probably is a pattern. But I think redraft versus dynasty, 2 quarterback, etc., have patterns. I think the pattern every year can fluctuate. I think if you look at the ADP, the wisdom of the crowd, it's very important not for following that opinions, but knowing what the crowd on average is going to think. And it's important to know when the top 3 tight ends are usually gone from the draft pool. It's important because you need to make that decision, you know, coming into your draft. Am I going to worry about that. Is that something that I feel is critical? I think there's going to be a lot of that uh, probably this year. Okay, people get going and they'll declare, my first pick is a tight end, or a quarterback, whatever the flavor is this year. They may win too, you know. If they played 100 leagues, would they win with that strategy? I, I don't know. I mean, that's part of it is keeping records of your past. But every draft has a pattern, and certainly the ADP is one way to think about that pattern. What's the value of the player? What were they valued last year? What are they going to be valued this year? There's the trick. What are they going to be? How did their team use them last year? Did they get a lot of opportunities or did they not get a lot of opportunities? Does free agency and rookie drafts change team usage? How strong is that position that the player is on? Are there a lot of good players, or is the player clearly the dominant one? Okay, the wide receiver one for the team. Attempts and targets can give us aspects of that, but we always have to think about new situations. New players coming in, natures of the player around a player. New coaches coming in, new systems. There's a lot of that out there. You hear a lot about it. Just remember, in fantasy football, it's hard to get enough data points for a lot of stats. We're kind of hampered that way. People try to do Bayesian models and all sorts of predictive analytics that model a system. That probably has used daily fantasy sports. Like I said, I suspect there's a lot more going on with people doing that than we know, and that probably makes sense. So just one of the reasons I'm pretty shy with daily fantasy is, when I've been shy, very conservative, because I would not risk a lot of money where I don't, where I'm the sucker at the table. I just can't do that. Okay. If it's fun money, then, go roll some dice or click red or black on the roulette wheel. People do projections. I like to think about my injury metrics and what happens if a player's injured. Who's the next man up? People always speculate about that. Every year, people start running for the waiver wires as soon as an injury. So I suggest make a little list, keep track, and kind of have some of these players on speed dial. When you hear of an injury, move first. What's the draft flow in your draft? Okay, when there's going to be a run of quarterbacks or tight ends, running backs are going off the table early. Okay, that's just a big thing. It's just take a look at last year's ADPs and the year before and the year before that. I've got all that data coming. How good is the player, even if they make it to the playoffs, 14, 15, 16 weeks, how good is it? Is it going to be a key player? Again, it's always good to know the ADP. Those are legitimate inquiries, not that we follow the ADP, but that we think about what the crowd is thinking about. I mean, if you're playing with a bunch of sharks, then they make their own ADPs. But if you're playing in public leagues, which are probably easier, uh, I'm not ashamed that I, fly under the radar on public leagues. It's easier to play. I make money. Why shouldn't I go do that? I will. You know, was in one league, and somebody, I guess Yahoo keeps track of how good you are or something, and somebody was complaining. I'm not going to debate anybody about how good or not good I am, whatever, as long as I'm there to collect a check. Those are just some bullet points I pulled out. I think there's more. The coherence, though, and what's important, that's the whole point of why I do off-season data. Try to inspire my coherency. Is that a word? I don't know if it is. In my data sets. So how should our analysis work? The doctor observes indicators and symptoms. Okay, they develop a diagnosis. It's an hypothesis, right? And you hope that then there are tests that can confirm, right? Different medical tests, and you see what you got and maybe a treatment. So you try to focus on what's important versus what not. So the doctor tries to be coherent. Well, my toe's hurting, but, my ears are ringing. Is that a connection there? The scientific method is, structured hypothesis-driven investigations. And so that's why I started my textbook. And a lot of people, frankly, I haven't, not paying to advertise it. Reason I did it is because it makes me do the work. And that's the reason I'm doing these video lessons, because it's making me think about things. I've written this down before, thought about it, left it for a while. Now I'm coming back. And basically, I'm off the cuff here. Okay? I do not have time to script my discussion of these lessons. It's just, I'm thinking as I'm thinking. So, if I did this again, it may change on my tangents. That's how I lecture. Again, the medical diagnosis to me focuses our attention to be a fantasy football analyst. And sometimes you have to do multiple hypotheses. That means multiple questions on a player, a team, a situation. And again, this going back to how coherent is our data? How much should we prune? What is the hierarchy of the value? What aspects are not very valuable? And again, different leagues and different conditions. A dynasty, maybe age is more critical than in redraft. I think it's going to be thought of that way. Not sure year by year. Certainly long term, I would think so. I've done some work on age. In fact, I've got some lectures on it. We'll look at age a little bit versus fantasy point production. So I think we're left with using the doctor. We want to be that method of being an analyst. And I'm highlighting principal component analysis. I'm actually going to make a little jump the next lecture on reference class forecasting, but I will then come back to principal component analysis. So I actually wrote this lecture before I thought about I should tell folks about reference class forecasting. Then I should do PCA. But anyway, I'll just explain it here and we'll go into more detail. So the PCA statistical approach is looking at observations of different variables. We just talked about coherence of variables. And usually going in, you do not know how correlated, that means saying the same thing or not, into a problem that these values are. And so a principal component test tries to parse out these variables and group them together and tell you these are saying and measuring the same components. So it's probably best not to go spend getting 10 different ways to say the one thing. So one metric will cover that component base. So I'm trying to prune it for you. So this transformation is a way that you'll get the first principal component. It's called RC1. That has the greatest possible variance that accounts for the variation in the data. In other words, the data is not going to be the same data point, right? All players don't score the same. So you have all these variation in, say, fantasy points. What is the component, that's the variable component, that allows us to explain the variation in players? Then the next group of variables is called RC2, and maybe we need to go to RC3, 4, 5, it can keep going. But at some point, we're going to run out of independent variables, and we're just kind of churning the same information. My dog wants in. Has the same highest variance possible under the constraints not related to the preceding components. And you could look on that on Wikipedia. How many non-related components exist? What variables are in those components? And the amount of association of those components within themselves from 0 to 1, from low to high association. So we can parse out all the variables in each pot and see which one's probably going to be the most critical to measure that component. So that's what principal component promises us that it can try to do. So we're going to explore that, and I'm going to look at quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends. I've got 4 lectures, 1 on each of those. The PCA of all those. Woo woo, we're having lots of extra fun here. Thanks for your attention. You can only get this from the process, and my name's Dr. Bush. Please come back. We're having lots of extra fun. Fun. Okay, later.